The night the blizzard closed the pass, and a man's whole herd stood to freeze in the open. It was Verity Hale. The drifter woman the town of Bell's Crossing had already half decided to run off, who walked out into the white dark to save them. And when she came back, near frozen herself, Caleb Ostrander caught her arm at the door and said, "Soft, don't run from me." And for the first time in her life, Verity Hale did not run. If this story moves you, do me a kindness before we go any further. Subscribe to the channel, follow it all the way to the end, because the part that will stay with you comes late, and leave the name of your town down in the comments so we can all watch together how far this story travels. Now let me carry you back to where it truly began, to a hard, bright morning some months before that blizzard, when Verity Hale walked into Bell's Crossing on foot, with a bedroll on her back, and every intention of being gone again before anyone could learn her name. She was a big woman, and she'd been big her whole life, broad through the shoulders, and full, and strong, in a way the world had only ever called too much. She was 38 that autumn, and she'd been hearing the same words since she was a girl too large for the orphanage cot. Too big, too dark, too plain. Nobody's going to keep all that. You'll wear out your welcome wherever you light. And she had. That was the wound under all the others, the one she never let her face show. Verity Hale had spent her whole life being moved along, passed from the orphanage to a hard place, and from that hard place to another, never wanted past her usefulness, never kept, until she'd learned to do the leaving herself, before anyone could do it to her. She left first. Always. It was the one power she had, and she'd worn it like armor so long she'd forgotten it was also a cage. So she came into Bell's Crossing the way she came into every town, with her face calm and her eyes already marking the road out, reading the place the way most folks read a letter, and reading, too, that she would not stay, because she never stayed, because staying was just standing still long enough to be thrown away. She took work where she could get it, the heavy work the laughing men didn't want, and she meant to earn a little and move on before the frost. But the work that came was at the Ostrander place, a cattle outfit east of town, gone short-handed and desperate. And desperate was the only kind of place that ever looked past Verity's body to her hands. Caleb Ostrander was the man who ran it, a tall, weathered, rope-lean man somewhere past 40, grey coming into his beard, slow and deliberate in everything he did, a widower these 3 years with a grief he wore quiet. He hired her to help bring the herd down from the high summer range before the snow, a hard fortnight's work, and he did not look at her the way the men in town looked at her, with that flick of the eyes that weighed and dismissed. He looked at her hands first, at the way she sat a horse, at her face last. "You've worked cattle," he said. "Not a question. I've worked most things," Verity said. "I won't be staying past the gather. I'll tell you that now, so you're not surprised later." She always told them that now. It was easier than being asked to leave. Caleb just nodded, slow, like a man filing a fact away, and said, "Fair enough. There's light left. Let's ride." She was good, and he saw it inside the first day. The way she read the country and the cattle both, knew before he did which draw the strays had taken, knew by the set of the sky when the weather would turn. By the third day, he'd stopped giving her orders and started asking her opinion, which was its own kind of miracle in Verity's experience. A man who'd rather be right than be the one who said it. There was a child on the place, a girl of 9, named Sadie, Caleb's daughter, motherless since the fever, a watchful, near-silent thing who studied Verity from doorways and corners, deciding, the way wary children do, whether this one would hurt her, or leave her, or both. Verity knew that child in her bones, because Verity had been that child, the one nobody kept, so she didn't push. She worked where Sadie could watch, left a twist of rock candy on the rail, talked low to her horse so the girl could listen without being looked at, and all the while, she told herself it didn't matter, she was leaving. Don't let the child matter. Don't let any of it matter, because things that matter are just things that hurt worse when you go. But the rock candy disappeared, and the girl crept closer by the day, and Verity felt the old armor strain at a seam she'd thought long since rusted shut. The old hand who'd worked Ostrander cattle 30 years was a flint-faced one named Mose, grey and stooped and sour, and he'd made up his mind about Verity before she'd unrolled her bedroll. A drifter, a woman, and one who looked like her besides, no good to anybody and gone by first snow. He grunted at her and turned his shoulder, but he watched, and the morning a green colt went down thrashing in a tangle of wire, and two young hands couldn't get near the flying hooves. It was Verity who waded in calm and big and unhurried, and got the colt still with her voice and her weight and her steady hands, and cut it free without a scratch on it, and Mose spat in the dust and allowed, grudging, that she'd do, which from Mose was as good as a brass band. Verity filed it away in the careful place where she kept the things that mattered, and then told herself it didn't matter, because she was leaving. She was always leaving. She just hadn't left yet. The trouble had a name, and the name was Thaddeus Crane, and he came riding out to the Ostrander place near the end of the gather in a fine buggy with a matched team, a soft, heavy man with a gold watch chain and a smile that sat on his face like something set there with a trowel. He owned the bank in Bell's Crossing and the freight line both, and he came, he said, as a neighbor to see how Caleb was managing his gather. He climbed down and looked around the outfit the way a man looks at property he's already counting, and when his eyes found Verity at the corral, his trowel smile widened in a way that put a cold finger down her spine. "Caleb," he called, warm as a parlor stove, "didn't know you'd taken on such a, substantial hand." He said it like she was livestock. Then, directly to her, loud and slow, as though she were simple, "You'll be moving along soon, I expect, big girl. Your kind always does." And there it was. The thing Verity had said about herself 100 times, turned into a weapon in a stranger's mouth, and it landed harder than she'd have allowed anyone to see. She gave him exactly nothing, not a flush, not a flinch, because she'd met 100 Thaddeus Cranes, and long ago stopped paying men like him the toll of a reaction. But she filed him away whole, every honeyed, poisoned word, because she'd understood the thing it would take Caleb weeks to see. Crane hadn't come neighboring. He'd come to measure how close the widower was to going under, because Caleb owed the bank, and the Ostrander Range held the high mountain water that fed the whole valley, and a grieving man short-handed before winter was the easiest mark in the county. What Crane could not have guessed was that Verity Hale could read a ledger the way she read the sky. In one of the hard places that raised her, there'd been a storekeeper who, for reasons of his own, taught the big unwanted girl her numbers and her letters and the plain language of a contract, the one good thing to come out of those years. And Verity had kept books on and off ever since, in between the leaving. So when Caleb, shy about it, asked would she look at his accounts before she went, since she had the head for it, and he plainly did not, she sat down at the dead wife's writing desk in the long gold light and found, inside an evening, the whole shape of the trap. Crane's bank held the note on the Ostrander place, and the interest had been creeping upward by small adjustments buried in renewal papers Caleb signed without close reading, grief-tired and trusting. And Crane's freight line, the only one that hauled Ostrander beef to the railhead, had been overcharging by a margin that, set against the crept-up interest, came near to the penny. A slow bleed from both ends, engineered to keep the outfit always one bad season from default, so that when the note came due, Caleb would come up short, and Crane could take the range and the mountain water for the price of a debt. Verity sat very still with that knowledge under her broad, scarred hands, and she thought, "This is not your fight. You are leaving. Walk away clean like you always do." But then she thought of the girl Sadie and the colt and Moses' grudging nod, and she found, to her own great trouble, that she could not make her feet move toward the road, because some things a body does because it's just plain right. She gathered the papers and went to find Caleb. He didn't want to believe it, not because she was a woman, and not for how she was made. He never once doubted her figures for those reasons, but because Thaddeus Crane had loaned him the money to bury his wife decent when he had nothing, and Caleb Ostrander was a man who held on to a debt of gratitude well past the point it served him, because gratitude was one of the few clean things the grief had left him. "He stood by me when she passed," Caleb said, quiet. "He's been bleeding you ever since," Verity said, gentle but plain. "From both ends, the note and the freight. Time to take your water when you fall short. I can show you in the figures, but the figures alone won't be enough against a man who owns the bank and the freight both. We'd need his freight line's own rate book, the real one, to prove he's charging you double what he charges the others." And then she heard herself say the word that frightened her more than any blizzard. We. She'd said we. She, who left before the leaves turned, had said we. Caleb heard it too. He looked at her a long moment in the lamplight, and he didn't remark on it. He just said, "Slow. You told me you'd not stay past the gather." "I know what I told you," Verity said. And Caleb Ostrander said the thing that mattered more than all the rest. He said, "Stay through this then. Just this, Verity." Her first name in his low voice. And she felt it land somewhere the old armor didn't reach, and she stayed. The weeks that followed were the staying weeks, and every single day of them, Verity fought the old pull toward the road, the voice that told her to go before she was sent, to leave before this could become one more thing that threw her away. But she stayed. She set Caleb's book straight and quietly gathered what she could of Crane's true rates, and the herd came down whole, and the girl Sadie crept closer and closer, until the evening she climbed up beside Verity on the porch step in the long gold light, leaned her small head against that big strong arm, and asked the question that undid her. "Are you going to leave?" Sadie said. "Like everybody leaves. Not crying." Just asking, the way a child asks a thing she already knows the answer to and is bracing for. And Verity Hale, who had left every place she'd ever set her bedroll, who had made an art and an armor of leaving first, looked down at that motherless girl and felt the whole architecture of her life crack straight down the middle, and she said, in a voice she barely knew, "I have left every place I ever was, Sadie. It's the only way I knew how to keep from being thrown out. But I am bone tired of running, and I don't want to run from you. So no, I don't believe I'm going to leave." And the girl said nothing, just pressed in closer, and Verity put her arm around her and held on, and felt something she'd kept shut for 38 years come open like a held breath finally let go. Then the blizzard came. It came howling down out of the pass with no warning the almanac had given, 2 days early, and twice as hard, and it caught the herd Verity had just brought down still bunched in the open near pasture instead of the sheltered draw, and Caleb and Mose and the young hands looked at the white roaring dark and knew the cattle would drift and pile and freeze by morning, the whole outfit's worth of them, the thing that stood between the Ostranders and the ruined Crane was waiting for. The men hesitated at the edge of that storm, because only a fool walks into a whiteout. But Verity had read this country for weeks, and she knew it now better than men born to it, knew the lay of the land under the snow, knew where the sheltered draw cut deep enough to break the wind, knew the one path that would move a panicked herd there without losing them over the cutbank in the blind dark. She didn't argue. She wrapped herself against the cold and took a lantern and a length of rope and walked out into the white, and she found the herd by sound and feel, and turned them, slow and sure and unhurried, her broad steady frame, a thing the frightened cattle would follow when a smaller figure would have been lost or trampled, and she brought them down into the sheltered draw, through a dark so complete she navigated by the slope of the ground under her own feet. It took hours. When she came staggering back to the house near Frozen, every animal was saved, and Caleb Ostrander met her at the door and caught her arm as she swayed, and looked at her, this woman who had walked into a killing storm for a herd that wasn't hers, and come back alive, and the thing he'd been holding back for weeks broke loose in him, and he said it low and rough and frightened. "Don't run from me." Just that, And Verity Hale, soaked and shaking and held up by his hand on her arm, understood that he wasn't talking about the storm. And for the first time in her whole running life, she didn't run. "I won't," she said. First touch. First true word. It landed where nothing had ever landed. But Thaddeus Crane had not grown rich by letting drowning men learn to swim, and word reached him that the Ostrander herd had been saved from the blizzard, the books set straight, the note likely to be paid after all, and he understood, the way his kind always eventually understands, that the thing that had changed was the big, quiet drifter woman who hadn't drifted on. So Crane did what men like Crane always do. He went after what he took to be the soft spot, and in Verity's case he thought he knew exactly what it was, because he'd named it himself in the yard. She was a drifter, a woman with no people and no roots, the easiest kind to drive off. He started in town, soft and grieved and reasonable, a word here and a word there, that Caleb Ostrander had a strange black woman living out on his place, a drifter with no past anyone could vouch for, that it wasn't decent, that a motherless white girl oughtn't be in the keeping of such a creature. The talk went through Bell's Crossing like fire through dry grass, and it found its way to Mrs. Adelaide Frost, who ran the church guild, and the school, and the settled opinion of every respectable woman in the county, and who drove out to the Ostrander place to tell Verity Hale, to her still and level face, exactly what the decent people had decided she was. Adelaide Frost was not a wicked woman. Verity saw that plain, even standing in the yard, taking the sharp edge of it, because Verity had spent a lifetime learning to tell wicked from wounded, and what stood before her, in its stiff grey wool, with its trembling righteous chin, was a frightened soul who had been left herself once. Verity could see it, abandoned young, by someone who should have stayed, and had built a fortress of rules and respectability, so that nothing could ever leave her unguarded again. So Verity didn't fight her. She let the woman say her whole piece, decency and propriety, and the drifter with no past. And then, in the quiet after, Verity said only, "Somebody left you, didn't they? A long time ago. Somebody who should have stayed and didn't. And you've been making sure ever since that you'd never be caught needing anybody again." Adelaide Frost went white to the lips. "You don't know the first thing about—" "I know it because I am it," Verity said, gentle as she'd ever said anything to a living soul. "I've spent 38 years leaving folks before they could leave me, Mrs. Frost. So don't think I can't read it on you like my own face in a glass. I'm not a drifter passing through to do harm. I'm a woman who finally found a place worth stopping for, and a child worth staying for, and I am done running. You think whatever you have to think of me to get through your day, but don't you set your old hurt on my back, because I've carried enough of my own." Adelaide Frost turned and left without one more word. But she did not drive straight home. She sat a long while at the end of the lane, and Verity, watching, understood that something had moved in the woman that would not move back. The reckoning came the day the note fell due, the way Verity had known it would, in town, in front of everyone. Crane had gathered it all to a head. The note due at the bank, the county assembled on settlement day, and Crane presiding from the bank steps with his trowel smile, certain that a grieving man and a rootless drifter woman could be rolled in front of the whole town. He stood before the gathered county and said, warm and grieved, that poor Caleb Ostrander's note was due, that the freight costs had eaten his margin, that the bank must regretfully take the range and its water. And Verity Hale stepped up out of the crowd, she who had spent her whole life at the edges of crowds, marking the road out, and stood square in the middle of this one, and said in a voice that carried clean across the whole dusty square, "Before you take 1 acre, you'd best let these folks hear how you fixed it so he couldn't pay." All of it, out loud. She had Crane's freight rate book. She'd gotten it 3 nights before, not stolen, but handed over, by Mose of all people, who had a nephew driving Crane's freight wagons, and who'd decided that an old sour man's penance was to make himself useful to the woman he'd doubted. And Verity had sat at the dead wife's desk in the long gold light, and matched that rate book against Caleb's freight bills and the bank's interest both, and now she read it out to the square, plain and slow, as scripture read to children. The rate Crane charged the other ranches to haul their beef. The rate he charged Caleb, near double, season on season. The interest crept up on renewal papers a grieving man signed unread, and how the two together, the overcharge and the inflated interest, came near to the penny, to the shortfall that would let Crane seize the range and the mountain water he meant to sell to the towns downstream for a fortune. You charged him double to haul, and you crept his interest up in papers you knew he was too sunk in grief to read, Verity said, and she'd gone quiet now. She didn't need to be loud. The whole square had fallen still as held breath. You bled him from both ends, and timed it to take his water when he fell short, and you reckoned nobody'd ever put the two books side by side, because the only one sharp enough to do it was a drifter you were sure you could run off before she did. You bet the whole thing on me leaving. Well, I didn't leave, and Thaddeus Crane, who had smiled through every word, made the one mistake men like him always make at the last. He let the smile slide off his face. He looked at the big black woman who had just laid him open before the entire county, and his soft features curdled into what was truly under them, and he said the ugly, contemptuous thing he actually felt, said it out loud, before he could catch it, and the whole square heard exactly what Thaddeus Crane was beneath the watch chain, and there was no smiling it back. It was Adelaide Frost who moved first. She came out of that crowd in her stiff grey wool and planted herself square beside Verity in the square, and she said, to Crane, to the whole staring county, and most of all to her own self, I will witness those books. I keep the guild's accounts, and I can read a rate book as well as any man here, and I will swear to what this woman has shown us, before any judge in the territory. And then quieter, just for Verity, she added, and she's right about me. I was left once. I've been hard about it 40 years. I'd not see her punished for being braver than I was. Then old Mose stepped up on Verity's other side, hat in his hands. Then a rancher named Pratt, whose own freight bills suddenly made a terrible new sense. Then a dozen more, until it was no longer one woman alone against the bank steps. It was the whole of Bell's Crossing, standing up at once for what was right. The circuit judge struck down the crept-up interest and threw Crane's freight monopoly open to investigation and bound him over for fraud on the strength of the two books Verity had laid side by side. Crane lost the bank and the freight line and his good name inside the season. The Ostrander note was settled honest, and the mountain water stayed where it belonged. And Caleb Ostrander stood in that dusty square with his daughter's hand in his, and looked at the woman who had walked into a blizzard and a courtroom, both for a family that hadn't been hers, and for the first time since he'd buried his wife, in front of all of Bell's Crossing. Caleb Ostrander smiled wide enough to break your heart. The outfit prospered the way a thing does when somebody who chose it finally tends it. The Ostrander range grew season on season into the finest in the valley, the herd fat, the water safe, and folks who'd called Verity a drifter now rode out to ask her how she read weather and cattle the way she did. A hidden gem of an outfit, they all said, saved off the edge of ruin. Verity kept the books and the range and the water, and old Mose took her word as gospel and was glad to, and Adelaide Frost came to Sunday dinner and taught Sadie her letters at the kitchen table, and never spoke of propriety again, and the two women who'd each been left too young became, in time, the unlikeliest of friends, each one teaching the other, slow, that not everybody leaves. And Sadie grew up tall and easy, and talked enough for 3 girls, and she called Verity no particular name at all, just turned to her for everything the way a body turns toward the sun, which was the only name that ever needed saying, and never once, not in all the years, did she have to wonder if Verity would be there in the morning, because she always was. Caleb was a slow man, and grief had made him slower, and Verity had spent her whole life leaving before she could be left. So the two of them came to each other the long, careful way that wary people do, through seasons of work shoulder to shoulder, through 1,000 small kindnesses, neither one ever announced. But there came an evening in the second autumn, the near pasture gone gold under a low sun, the two of them leaning on the fence, watching the healthy herd move like a slow river across the range she'd refused to leave, when Caleb Ostrander said more words at one time than Verity had ever heard out of him. He said the day she'd walked up his road, telling him she wouldn't stay past the gather, he'd believed her, because she'd said it like a woman stating a law of nature. He said he'd watched her save his books and his herd and his daughter's whole world, watched her walk into a killing storm and a hostile courtroom both, and come back standing. And somewhere in all of it, he'd come to understand the thing the town had been too blind to see. That every quality they'd mocked in her bigness, her color, her too-muchness, even the drifting they'd sneered at, every single thing the world had shamed her for, was the exact set of things that had saved his family. Her broad, strong frame was the measure of what she could carry, and the reason the storm hadn't taken her. Her hard-won wariness was the same gift that let her read a cheat in a ledger and a wound in a bitter woman's face. And the leaving was just a strong heart that had never once been given a reason to stay. He meant to be that reason. The day you came, you told me you'd not stay, he said, slow and plain, the long gold light running across both their faces. And I've spent every day since hoping to give you cause to call yourself a liar. I'll not ask you to stay, because you've nowhere else to go. You could go anywhere. You're the most capable soul I ever met. I watched a man try to own this whole valley by treating folks as things to be used and run off, and I'd sooner lie down in the ground than be the likes of him. So I'm not asking you to stay because you're trapped. I'm asking you to stay because you choose us. Your name on the deed beside mine because you earned it. Your say equal to mine. The girl, already yours, in every way that counts. Stay because you want to, Verity. Not because you can't run, because for once in your life, you don't want to. And Verity Hale, who had left every place she'd ever lit, who had been told her whole long life that she was too big and too dark and too much for anyone to ever keep, who had made leaving into the only armor she had, stood in the long gold light beside a quiet, decent man on land she had walked into a blizzard to save, and she felt the old armor come loose all the way at last and slip down off her broad, strong shoulders, and she found that she did not need it any more. She was not too much, she was not too little. She was not a drifter the world moved along. She was wanted, and chosen, and home. She thought of every road she'd walked out of every town, alone, before anyone could send her. She thought of every word ever thrown at her like a stone. And then she let all of it go, the way you let go of a weight you no longer have to carry. And she heard again the rough, soft voice at the door in the storm, "Don't run from me." And she turned to Caleb Ostrander in the gold light and gave him the only answer that had ever been true, the answer she'd been running away from her whole hard life, until she finally understood it was the one thing worth running toward. "I'm not running," she said. "Not anymore. I'm staying." And she did.